Theodore Judah walked across the Sierra Nevada 23 times, on foot, through granite canyons, over 13,000-foot passes, in snow that buried his survey markers. He was looking for something every other engineer said didn't exist, a route for a railroad through the most brutal mountain range on the continent. They called him Crazy Judah. The investors laughed. Congress ignored him. His own partners tried to push him out. He found the route, he convinced Congress to fund it, and then, 6 days before construction began, on the greatest engineering project in American history, Theodore Judah died. He was 37 years old. This is the story of the man who made the impossible possible, and the men who erased him from history. Theodore DeHone Judah was born on March 4, 1826 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His father was an Episcopal minister. His mother raised him to believe that God had a purpose for every man's life. Theodore found his purpose early. By the time he was 13 years old, he was obsessed with railroads. Not the way a boy is obsessed with trains. The way a prophet is obsessed with a vision. He would walk the tracks near his home for hours, studying how the rails curved, how the grades climbed, how engineers had conquered hills and rivers and swamps to lay iron across the land. At 17, he enrolled at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, one of the few places in America where you could study engineering as a science. He graduated in 2 years. By 21, he was building railroads. His first major project was the Niagara Gorge Railroad, a line carved into the cliffs below Niagara Falls. The engineers before him had said it couldn't be done. The rock was too hard, the gorge too narrow, the falls too close. Judah did it anyway. Then came the Erie Canal enlargement, then a railroad through the Green Mountains of Vermont. Every project they called impossible, Judah made possible. He had a gift. He could look at terrain that defeated other men and see the path through it. But none of these projects satisfied him. They were regional lines, small ambitions. Theodore Judah had a vision that consumed his waking hours and haunted his dreams, a railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a single track binding the continent together. In 1854, he got his chance. A group of Sacramento businessmen hired him to build California's first railroad, the Sacramento Valley Railroad, on 22 miles of track from the city to the gold mining towns in the foothills. Judah was 28 years old when he arrived in California. He brought with him his wife, Anna Pierce Judah, a woman who would become his partner in every sense of the word. She would carry his surveying instruments, she would draw his maps, she would transcribe his notes by candlelight in mining camp tents, and she would watch him destroy himself chasing a dream. The Sacramento Valley Railroad was finished in 1856. It was the first railroad west of the Missouri River, but for Judah, it was just the beginning. Standing at the end of that line, looking east toward the Sierra Nevada, he saw what no one else could see. A path through the mountains. You need to understand what the Sierra Nevada meant in 1856. So this was the mountain range that had killed the Donner Party. 87 emigrants trapped in the snow at 7,000 feet, 41 dead, the survivors eating the flesh of the dead to stay alive. That was only 10 years before Judah arrived in California. The memory was still raw. The Sierra Nevada rises from the Sacramento Valley like a wall. Not a gradual climb, a barrier. The western slope is relatively gentle, but it runs for 60 miles before you reach the summit. Then the eastern slope drops thousands of feet in just a few miles. Granite cliffs, canyons so deep the sun doesn't reach the bottom until noon, and snow. 30, 40, 50 feet of snow in winter. Snow that would bury a man standing upright. Every engineer who looked at the Sierra said the same thing. There was no route. The grades were too steep for locomotives. The canyons were too deep for bridges. The snow would close any track for 6 months of the year. A transcontinental railroad was a fantasy. Theodore Judah looked at the same mountains and saw something different. He saw the route. He just had to find it. In 1857, he began walking. Not surveying, not yet, just walking. Mile after mile, canyon after canyon, pass after pass, he crossed the Sierra Nevada that year, and the next year, and the next. 23 times in total, he would cross those mountains, sometimes on horseback, often on foot, always looking. Anna went with him when she could. Picture them together on those expeditions. Theodore scrambling up granite slopes with his surveying instruments strapped to his back. Anna behind him, notebook in hand, recording everything he saw. The elevation of every ridge, the grade of every canyon, the depth of every river crossing. They slept in mining camps and Indian villages and under the open sky. They ate whatever they could find. They nearly froze to death more than once. And the whole time, the men in San Francisco laughed at him. Crazy Judah, they called him. The man who thinks he can put a railroad through a wall of granite. But Judah kept walking, because he knew something they didn't know. He knew the route existed. He could feel it. And in the summer of 1860, he found it. A druggist named Daniel Strong ran a store in the mining town of Dutch Flat. Strong had spent years exploring the mountains around his town, looking for gold deposits. He knew the terrain better than almost anyone alive. One day, he mentioned to a friend that he'd found an unusual route over the summit. A path where the grade never exceeded 100 feet per mile, where natural ridges provided protection from avalanches, where the elevation at the summit was lower than any other crossing for 100 miles. That friend told Judah, and Judah rode to Dutch Flat as fast as his horse could carry him. Strong took him up the ridge. They climbed through forests of sugar pine and red fir. They crossed meadows thick with wildflowers, and they reached a pass that Judah had walked past a dozen times without seeing, Donner Pass. Judah stood at the summit and looked east toward the desert. He looked west toward the Sacramento Valley, and he knew. This was it. This was the route that every engineer in America said didn't exist. He surveyed it that same week, working from dawn until dark, measuring every foot of the approach. The numbers confirmed what his eyes had told him. A railroad could climb from Sacramento to this summit with grades manageable by the locomotives of the day. It would require tunnels, yes. It would require bridges. It would require engineering on a scale never attempted in America. But it was possible. Judah drew the maps himself. He calculated the costs. He wrote a report so detailed that an engineer reading it today could build the railroad from his notes alone. And then he went to San Francisco to find investors. They laughed at him. Again, the big money men of San Francisco had heard Judah's pitch before. A transcontinental railroad, millions of dollars in construction costs, years of work through impossible terrain. And for what? To connect California to a country 3,000 miles away? California was doing just fine on its own. I thank you. The gold was flowing, the ships were arriving. Why risk everything on a railroad? Judah couldn't find a single investor in San Francisco willing to put up money. So he went back to Sacramento. To the smaller men, the shopkeepers and merchants who didn't have millions but who understood something the rich men didn't. Sacramento was dying. The gold rush was ending. The easy gold was gone. The miners were leaving. And without the miners, the merchants would starve. Sacramento needed something to bring money back to the city. A railroad to the east would make Sacramento the gateway to California. Every person, every pound of freight, every piece of mail traveling west would pass through their city. Judah held a meeting in a room above a hardware store on K Street. November 1860. The same month, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. The same month, the South began to secede. In that room sat 4 men who would change American history. Collis Huntington, a hardware merchant, Mark Hopkins, his partner, Charles Crocker, a dry goods dealer, Leland Stanford, a wholesale grocer who would soon become governor of California. They called themselves the Big Four. They would become the most powerful railroad barons in the American West. They would build empires on the labor of thousands of men. They would accumulate wealth beyond imagination. And they would betray the man who made it all possible. But on that November night, they were just 4 merchants looking for a way to save their businesses. And Theodore Judah showed them the way. He laid out his maps on the table. He walked them through every mile of the route. He showed them the surveys, the calculations, the engineering solutions. And then he showed them something else, the Pacific Railroad Act. Judah had been to Washington multiple times. He had lobbied Congress for years, arguing that a transcontinental railroad was a matter of national security. He had shown them maps, he had made speeches, he had cornered senators in hallways and congressmen at dinner parties. And finally, Congress was listening. The Pacific Railroad Act would grant enormous subsidies to any company that built a railroad from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. Government bonds worth $16,000 for every mile of track on flat land, $48,000 for every mile through the mountains, plus land grants, 10 square miles of public land for every mile of track, millions of acres in total. The Big Four looked at those numbers and saw something Judah didn't see. They saw a fortune that had nothing to do with actually operating a railroad. They saw construction subsidies and land grants and government bonds. They saw a way to get rich whether the railroad ever carried a single passenger or not. On June 28, 1861, they incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad of California. Theodore Judah was named chief engineer. He held a significant stake in the company. He believed he was finally going to build his railroad. But first, he had to convince Congress to pass the Pacific Railroad Act, and that meant going to Washington. If you want to understand how Theodore Judah got Congress to fund the most expensive infrastructure project in American history, you need to understand the man. He wasn't a politician. He didn't have money to spread around. He didn't have powerful friends. What he had was an obsession so pure, so complete, so absolutely unwavering that it could bend reality. Judah arrived in Washington in the fall of 1861. The country was at war. Confederate armies had just routed Union forces at Bull Run. Lincoln was trying to hold the nation together. Nobody in the Capitol wanted to hear about a railroad. Nobody except Judah. He rented a room in the Capitol building itself. He filled it with maps and surveys and engineering drawings. He called it his railroad museum. And then he started working. Every congressman, every senator, every cabinet official who would give him 5 minutes, Judah cornered. He showed them the route, he explained the engineering, he walked them through the finances. He argued that the railroad would bind California to the Union, that it would open markets across the Pacific, that it would make America a continental power. But his most powerful argument was simpler than all of that. The South had seceded. The southern route for a transcontinental railroad, the route that had blocked all previous legislation, was now in enemy hands. If Congress wanted a railroad to the Pacific, there was only one way to build it: through the mountains, through Judah's route. The Pacific Railroad Act passed on July 1st, 1862. Lincoln signed it that same day. The Central Pacific Railroad was authorized to build east from Sacramento. The Union Pacific Railroad was authorized to build west from Omaha. Whoever built more miles would get more subsidies, more land grants, more money. Judah sent a telegram to Sacramento, and it said simply, "We have drawn the elephant. Now, let us see if we can harness him." He rushed back to California to begin construction, and that's when he discovered what the Big Four had been doing while he was gone. Leland Stanford was now governor of California. He had used his position to steer state bonds toward the Central Pacific. Legitimate enough. But Collis Huntington and the others had been busy with something else. They had found a geologist willing to certify that the Sierra Nevada foothills began much closer to Sacramento than they actually did. Why did this matter? Because the Pacific Railroad Act paid $48,000 per mile through the mountains, and only $16,000 per mile across flat land. By moving the official start of the mountains 20 miles closer to Sacramento, the Big Four had just given themselves an extra $640,000 in subsidies. For track that would cost them nowhere near that amount to build. It was fraud. Pure and simple, fraud against the federal government, fraud that enriched the Big Four at taxpayer expense. And Theodore Judah wanted no part of it. He confronted them. We don't know exactly what was said in that meeting. But we know the result. The Big Four offered to buy Judah out. He refused. They offered him money to look the other way. He refused. They suggested that if he didn't like how they were running things, perhaps he should find other investors. Investors who shared his scruples. And that's exactly what Judah decided to do. In the fall of 1863, Theodore Judah boarded a steamship bound for New York. He carried with him documentation of everything the Big Four had done. He had meetings scheduled with Cornelius Vanderbilt and other Eastern financiers, men with enough money to buy out the Big Four stake in the Central Pacific, men who might actually want to build a railroad rather than just collect subsidies. The fastest route from California to New York was by ship to Panama, across the isthmus by train, and then by ship again to the Atlantic coast. Thousands of people made this journey every year. Most survived. Theodore Judah contracted yellow fever crossing Panama. By the time the ship reached New York, he was too sick to walk. Anna was with him. She watched her husband, the man who had crossed the Sierra Nevada 23 times, struggle to climb a flight of stairs. He was carried to a hotel room. Doctors were summoned. There was nothing they could do. Theodore Dehone Judah died on November 2, 1863. He was 37 years old. He never saw a single mile of track laid on the railroad he had made possible. 6 days after Judah died, the Central Pacific Railroad broke ground in Sacramento. They used his surveys. They followed his route. They built exactly the railroad he had planned, through exactly the passes he had mapped, using exactly the engineering solutions he had designed, and they erased him from history. The Big Four went on to become the most powerful men in the West. Leland Stanford founded a university. Collis Huntington built railroads across the country. Charles Crocker and Mark Hopkins became names that still grace San Francisco landmarks. When the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, completing the Transcontinental Railroad, they were all there. Theodore Judah's name was not mentioned in a single speech. The railroad he had given his life to create became the foundation of their fortunes. They used the construction subsidies to enrich themselves. They manipulated stock prices. They bribed legislators. They built a monopoly that would dominate California for decades, all on the shoulders of the man they had betrayed. But the railroad got built. That's the tragedy and the triumph of Theodore Judah's story. The railroad got built. Think about what that meant. In 1869, a journey from New York to San Francisco took 6 months by sea or 4 months by wagon. After May 10, 1869, it took 6 days. 6 days to cross a continent. 6 days to connect a nation. The men who built that railroad deserve to be remembered. Not the Big Four, the workers. 12,000 Chinese laborers who carved the route through the Sierra Nevada. Irish immigrants who laid track across the Nevada desert. Veterans of both armies, Union and Confederate, working side by side just years after the war. These men did the impossible. They tunneled through 1,000 feet of solid granite at the summit. They worked through winters so brutal that entire work camps were buried in snow. They lowered Chinese workers in baskets over 1,000-foot cliffs to drill holes for dynamite. They died by the hundreds from explosions, from avalanches, from simple exhaustion. The Central Pacific never kept accurate records of how many workers died building the railroad. Estimates range from several hundred to over 1,000. Most of the Chinese dead were never identified by name. Their bones were collected after construction and shipped back to China for burial. If you walk the route today, through the tunnels they carved with hand drills and black powder, you walk through their tomb. But the railroad got built. Theodore Judah's railroad. The route he had found by walking 23 times across mountains that killed other men. The route that Congress funded because he refused to give up. The route that connected America from sea to shining sea. Anna Pierce. Judah lived until 1921. She was 90 years old when she died. For nearly 60 years, she kept her husband's memory alive. She wrote letters to historians. She gave interviews to journalists. She preserved his maps and surveys and notes. When people asked her about Theodore, she always said the same thing. He was not crazy. He was the only sane man in a room full of fools. He saw what no one else could see. And he was right. There's a plaque in Sacramento today at the site where the Central Pacific Railroad began construction. It mentions Theodore Judah, one of the few official acknowledgments of his contribution. If you didn't know to look for it, you would walk right past. But the railroad is still there. Not the original track, not anymore, but the route, the path through the mountains that Judah found. Amtrak's California Zephyr still follows it. Freight trains carrying goods from China still use it. Every day, dozens of trains pass through Donner Pass, over the summit that Judah surveyed on foot in the summer of 1860. He found the route. He convinced Congress to fund it. He designed the engineering solutions that made it possible. And he never saw a single mile of track. That's the cost of vision. Sometimes the man who sees the future doesn't get to live in it. Sometimes the prophet dies before the promised land. Theodore Judah was buried in Greenfield Cemetery in New York, 3,000 miles from the mountains he loved, 3,000 miles from the railroad he made possible. The Big Four built monuments to themselves: Stanford University, the Huntington Library, the Crocker Art Museum. Their names are carved in stone across California. Theodore Judah's monument is different. It's not made of stone, it's made of iron and wood and the sweat of 12,000 men. It stretches from Sacramento to Promontory Summit. It still carries trains today. Every time a locomotive crosses the Sierra Nevada, it follows his route. Every time a train passes through Donner Pass, it vindicates his vision. Every time freight moves from the Pacific ports to the American heartland, it travels the path he found. They called him Crazy Judah. They laughed at him. They betrayed him. They erased him from history. But the railroad is still there. And if you want to know who really built the Transcontinental Railroad, don't look at the Golden Spike ceremony. Don't look at the photographs of the Big Four in their top hats and fine coats. Look at the man who walked across the Sierra Nevada 23 times because he believed something was possible when everyone else said it wasn't. Look at Theodore Judah. He gave everything for a railroad he never saw. He died for a vision that other men got rich from. He was forgotten by the country he helped unite. But the railroad is still there. Some men are remembered for what they took. Theodore Judah should be remembered for what he gave: his health, his fortune, his reputation, his life. All for a railroad that would transform America. 23 crossings, one route, one railroad, and a man who believed so completely in the impossible that he made it possible. That's the story of Theodore Judah, the crazy man who saw what no one else could see, the engineer who mapped the impossible route, the visionary who died before his vision became real. If you've watched this far, you're not here for entertainment. You're here because you understand that the stories we've forgotten matter as much as the ones we remember. You're here because you know that the men who built America deserve more than a plaque in a forgotten corner of a Sacramento sidewalk. There's a lesson in Theodore Judah's story. Not a comfortable one. Vision isn't enough. Dedication isn't enough. Being right isn't enough. You can find the route, draw the maps, convince the government, design the solutions, and still have it all taken from you by men who care more about money than legacy. But here's the other lesson, the one that matters more. The railroad got built anyway. Not because the Big Four were geniuses. Not because money always wins. The railroad got built because Theodore Judah's vision was so complete, so detailed, so perfectly realized that no one could stop it. They could steal the credit. They could erase his name. They could get rich off his work. But they couldn't undo what he had done. He found the route. And once the route was found, the railroad was inevitable. That's the power of vision. Real vision. Not the kind that makes speeches and raises money, the kind that walks across a mountain range 23 times, the kind that measures every grade and calculates every cost and draws every map, the kind that refuses to stop even when everyone says you're crazy. Theodore Judah was crazy. Crazy enough to believe he could put a railroad through the Sierra Nevada when every engineer in America said it was impossible. Crazy enough to keep walking when smarter men would have given up. Crazy enough to die for a dream he never got to see. That's the kind of crazy that changes the world. Anna kept his papers until she died. She donated them to various historical societies. His original surveys, his maps, his calculations, they're still there if you know where to look. The handwriting of a man who saw the future before anyone else. The last time Anna visited the Sierra Nevada was in 1889, 26 years after Theodore's death. The railroad was running smoothly by then. Trains crossed the mountains every day. She rode one to the summit, to Donner Pass. She stood where her husband had stood in 1860, where he had looked east and west and known that this was the place, the route that would unite a nation. The tracks were there now, iron rails gleaming in the mountain sun, trains passing every few hours, the impossible made real. She stayed for an hour. She didn't say anything to anyone. She just stood and watched the trains pass through the mountains that had killed the Donner Party. The mountains that every engineer said no railroad could cross. The mountains her husband had conquered with nothing but his own 2 feet. and an unwavering belief in what was possible. Then she got back on the train and rode down to Sacramento. She never visited the mountains again. Theodore Judah has been dead for over 160 years now. The Big Four have been dead almost as long. Their fortunes have been divided and divided again through generations of heirs. Their names survive on buildings and institutions. Their legacy is complicated at best. But the railroad is still there. Donner Pass still carries trains. The route Judah surveyed still moves freight and passengers across the continent. The impossible thing he made possible is still part of everyday American life. Next time you see a freight train passing through, carrying goods from Shanghai or Seoul or Singapore to the warehouses of Middle America, remember Theodore Judah. Remember the man who walked across the Sierra Nevada 23 times. Remember the crazy engineer who found the route no one believed existed. Remember what it cost him. And remember that some visions are worth dying for. The railroad is still there, and that's the only memorial Theodore Judah would have wanted.